Hello, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, I, Alfonso Pescador, with Sam Lorenzo and Cledian Mendoza, will be discussing Albert Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. The myth of Sisyphus is a legend about a man who is sentenced to roll a stone for the rest of his life. Albert Camus, a French Algerian journalist, playwright, novelist, Nobel Prize winner, and philosopher, although he dislikes the term philosopher, used this story to explain the absurd. Camus was also a pioneer of existentialism, but he preferred not to be classified as an existentialist. Rationalism, according to Camus, is the belief that human reason can make sense of the world it inhabits. It is based on the hope that we will be able to explain why things are the way they are. Camus is a rationalist in the sense that he is concerned with the idea that the mind cannot make sense of experience, but he opposes rationalism in favor of absurdism. Many of his main ideas were stated, rather than argued in his texts. He used metaphors to explain others, and he focused on immediate and personal experience. A brief history of the myth of Sisyphus. Camus started working on it in 1940, during the fall of France, when millions of people fled from the advancing German armies. This helped him understand the absurd, even though the event isn't mentioned very often in the essay. The essay was written and published in French in 1942. Its English translation was first published in 1955 by Justin O'Brien. A preface written by Camus while in Paris in 1955 is included in the translated version.
For the next concept, trigger warning lang po since we will be mentioning suicide. So as psychology students, hindi na tayo bago sa pag-uusap regarding suicide. However, in this case, we will talk more about philosophical suicide more than psychological view on suicide. So, suicide in psychology, as defined by the American Psychological Association, is the act of killing oneself. It is actually the 10th leading cause of death in the US according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In addition to this, gaya ng napag-aralan natin sa ating mga previous psych classes, suicide is triggered by a lot of stimulus, tulad ng psychological problems like depression, anxiety, at iba pa. Thus, Levi-Bells defined suicide as the behavior motivated by the desire to escape from an unbearable psychological pain. Karaniwan, ang suicide ang nakikitang escape route ng mga tao to end their suffering. Before we proceed sa philosophical suicide, Albert Camus believed that suicide is motivated by our inability to withstand the weight of life's absurdity and futility. Here he is talking about both literal and philosophical suicide. May mga pagkakataon kasi nagiging worthless, senseless, at unreasonable ang mga nangyayari sa buhay natin. The question of suicide ultimately isn't so much about suffering. It's more about absurdity, futility, and meaninglessness because those sorts of factors are what makes suffering unbearable. It is a response to how absurd life actually is. So Albert Camus said that there is but one truly serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. Ang tanong na iyan ang susubukan nating sagutin ngayon. Philosophical suicide in this case is the way to avoid or escape the unsettling confrontation with life's absurd nature. Maraming mga bagay sa buhay natin na nanatiling unanswered or beyond our understanding, ika nga. Maraming sumusubok ipaliwanag ang mga ito tulad ng science at religion. It is killing off the inquiring and honest part of our minds. It is shutting down our native curiosity. Philosophical suicide accomplishes the evasion by providing soothing answers to life-insoluble questions and uncertainties. Saan kaya nanggagaling yung quote-unquote soothing answers na ito? So, paano tayo nakakapag-commit ng philosophical suicide while still going on with our biological life? So, Camus believes that there are numerous ways, but one certain way is the belief in God. How is belief in God a way of killing off part of our minds and part of our perceptual fields? This is how. Through believing to a supreme being na omniscient or all-knowing, we can escape lahat ng absurdities at uncertainties na meron sa buhay natin. Faith is the answer, kumbaga. Hindi ba't minsan kapag may injustice na nangyayari sa atin, kahit alam natin hindi naman natin deserve, we tend to accept it kasi baka may balak si Lord or baka hindi will ni Lord, regardless sa religion, example lang yan. Essentially, that is all for psychological and philosophical suicide.
The absurd. Absurdity arises from our conflict between our desire for clarity and our understanding of the world's irrationality. We live with a sense of meaning and purpose throughout our lives, but our daily actions can be perceived as a force of habit. The sense of absurdity is linked to the sense that life has no meaning. Man expects and hopes to find some meaning in the world, says Camus, and whatever meaning the world may have is concealed from man. Camus asserts that the absurd is our fundamental relationship with the world because it is the link between the only two facts we can know for certain. Camus then poses the following question: should I commit suicide or should I commit philosophical suicide? Camus sees suicide as a natural response to the underlying premise that life is absurd in a variety of ways. Many existential philosophers seek to find transcendence in the absurd itself. They try to escape from the absurd. These philosophers commit philosophical suicide by avoiding the logic posed by the absurd. Camus maintains that the logic of the absurd requires no transcendence. In the Myth of Sisyphus, Camus' goal is to determine whether it is possible to live simply with what he knows.
So, ayan. Punta naman tayo sa Myth of Sisyphus. So, just to give a little bit of background, Sisyphus is probably more famous for his punishment in the underworld than for what he did in his life. So, according to the Greek myth, si Sisyphus ay na-condemned to roll a rock up to the top of a mountain only to have the rock roll back down to the bottom every time he reaches the top. So, accordingly kay Camus, as a life filled entirely of mundane and trivial labor, yung existence ni Sisyphus is meant to illustrate the futility and absurdity that we confront in our own lives. So, na-observe ni Camus that a person's life can become essentially a mundane routine like waking up, pupunta sa trabaho, 4 hours in the office or the factory, kain, then balik ulit sa trabaho, 4 hours of work, meals, uwi sa bahay, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday according to the same rhythm. So, yet, for Camus, si Sisyphus ay hindi dapat kaawaan. Sisyphus represents the absurd hero because he chooses to live in the face of absurdity. So, this choosing to live is a matter of consciousness, for through his attitude and outlook, Sisyphus can free himself from his punishment and triumph over his situation without being able to change it. So, si Sisyphus is aware din sa full extent of his punishment. He is fully conscious of the fate imposed on him by the gods and the utter futility of his existence. Yung kanyang passion, freedom, and revolt made him stronger than the punishment intended to crush him. So, though it may seem odd, Camus indicates that Sisyphus is happy by making his rock his thing. Sisyphus finds joy in being. So perhaps the climb up becomes more comfortable over time. Maybe the muscles that once strained under the weight of the rock now effortlessly control it. So conceivably, the rock moves so gracefully upwards that the act of moving it becomes a work of art. So, through his freedom, Sisyphus revolts against the gods and refuses the futility of their punishment by consciously living with passion. So the rock, the mountain, the sky, and the dirt belong to him and are his world. Sisyphus has no hope to change his situation, but nevertheless, he uses all that's given to and available for him. So, ina-identify din ni Camus si Sisyphus as the archetypal absurd hero, both for his behavior on Earth and for his punishment in the underworld. So, he displays scorn for the gods, a hatred of death, and a passion for life. Yung kanyang punishment is to endure an eternity of hopeless struggle. So, sa repetition and futility naman. So, Camus compares the reality of much our lives with the classical myth of Sisyphus. So, ayan. So, Camus calls Sisyphus the proletarian of the gods precisely because our own lives match his situation so often. So, at some level, practically, everything you do is repetition of others' things you've known. So, the point here is that, like Sisyphus, our own lives involve lots of intense labor with mostly repetitive quality to it. So, the more troubling similarity to Sisyphus probably lies in the prospect that life gives us no particular reason to believe that our labors will ultimately amount to anything. So, isn't it life's deeper reality that all of your best friends' accomplishments and contributions will eventually become eminently forgettable and unimportant? So, yung point nga dito is that, like Sisyphus, we too are condemned to an existence that offers absolutely no guarantee that any of our repetitive labors will amount to anything whatsoever. And the same holds true for the whole of humanity. So, what really makes our existential situation absurd is not merely that we live lives filled with lots of futile labor with no guarantee that it adds up to anything. So, what makes human existence particularly absurd is that we are conscious of it. So, or at least that we can be. So, that's the absurdity of our existence. Like Sisyphus, punishment truly takes on the character of a kind of condemnation. So, hopelessness and meaninglessness. So, for Camus, our mortal lives are in reality every bit of hopeless and meaningless. Meaningless. So, mostly because the universe doesn't particularly offer us hope or meaning. So, believing in the significance of our lives and accomplishment is mostly a way of evading the unpleasant realization that life offers no concrete affirmation of our significance or whatsoever. So, in addition with this, life itself offers us no reasons to center our lives around hope or meaning, especially since life dashes our hopes and sense of purpose about as often as it affirms them. So also life significance, hope, and meaning are most ways of placing emphasis on possibilities that life itself may or may not affirm. So the deeper reality is that life is not particularly rise to human hopes and human meaning any more than it's tied to human accomplishments. So, Camus sees hope and meanings as human fabrications, as a kind of disease, as distractions, and as forms of philosophical suicide. So, Camus makes the further shocking claim that the thing that really matters about life is simply its quantity, how much of it one gets, rather than its quality. What counts is not the best living, but the most living.
Another concept depicted by the myth of Sisyphus is the existential defiance. How can we confront all of life's absurdities while still moving forward in our lives? Existential defiance. Para kay Camus, it remains an open question pa rin on whether one can live with a full cognizance or full knowledge of life's absurdity, repetition, futility, and hopelessness, or whether one must resort to suicide of one sort or another. Para kay Camus, there are two possible responses sa absurd events sa ating buhay. Scorn or embrace mo pa fully yung absurdities na iyon. First response, Katulad ni Sisyphus sa ating myth, maaaring maging reaction natin sa absurdities sa life ay scorn. Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to a circular futile labor. Since this is a metaphor of our own lives, how do we deal with this infinite futility? Through scorn. We might feel hatred, anger, or minsan nga violence pa. There is a line sa text na, "There is no fate that cannot be overcome by scorn." For Camus, the way to deal with our condemnation is not to accept it. Condemnation is given to make you suffer, so defy the purpose of it. The acceptance of the absurd is non sequitur or incoherent because it would mean not realizing how bad the situation is. Kasi kung aware ang isang tao sa absurdities around, ang tao ay magiging defiant at any level. Any attempt to accept the absurd ay naglilid sa philosophical suicide because in that case, you are trying to escape the confrontation with life's absurd nature. The lucidity that Camus recommends demands a full recognition of the absurd, but it also demands a defiant non-acceptance of it. In short, kailangan natin i-recognize yung mga absurdities sa buhay, pero, at isang malaking pero, dinedemand din sa atin ni Camus to be defiant and not to accept the absurd. Defiance nga raw nagpe-prevent ng literal suicide from being a viable response sa absurd. Kadalasan nga 'di ba, pag defiant ka ay matigas ang ulo mo. So imbes na you accept the misfortunes, nagde-defy na lang tayo. Pero at isang malaking pero ulit, the Camusian perspective says that defiance, like being angry or fighting everybody else, is not the most defiant response. In fact, the Camusian perspective of that is that by being angry all the time, you are actually agreeing with the structure of condemnation because it means that you are having a bad time. Literal suicide is also not the answer according to Camus, because again, if killing yourself as a response to absurdities, you are again agreeing with the character of condemnation. It would mean that you are so miserable that you cannot continue living. The most defiant thing to do is have a good time. It is the second possible response to our absurd predicament. Using one's cognizance or awareness of the absurd, we embrace life even more fully. Para bagang go with the flow, YOLO, or finding the silver lining in the situation. But how can we embrace something and at the same time entertain a defiant non-acceptance of it? Challenging nga raw ito, sabi ni Albert Camus. Relating to Sisyphus, he responded to his condemnation by actually embracing his task despite being fully conscious of its repetition and its ultimate futility. Sisyphus negates the character of his condemnation and actually becomes pleased with his fate. Embracing his fate is Sisyphus' ultimate act of defiance. A good example of this is the case of Timothy Leary. He is a maverick professor of psychology from Harvard. He got into LSD research and when LSD was made illegal, he still decided to continue the research. Syempre, dahil illegal nga, ikinulong siya in isolation, Bartolina, if you know that word. 23 hours a day siyang puro walls lang yung nakikita. Then when he got released, reporters asked him what it was like. At ina-expect nilang mag-apologize si Timothy Leary sa ginawa niya. But to their surprise, sinabi pa ni Leary na prison was the greatest experience in his life. Kasi parang naging celebrity pa siya noon. Nalaman ng news every now and then, tapos maraming nanghihingi ng interview mula sa kanya. Pero ang pinakakagulat-gulat niyang sinabi ay prison was the best vacation he has ever wanted before dahil sa unlimited meditation na nakuha niya. Hindi ba't in that case, iyon ang greatest form of defiance mo toward the condemnation given to you? Para bang joke lang ang lahat, is a prank? Kidding aside, that is the essence of existential defiance. So, given everything na idinaldal naming tatlo, let's answer the ultimate philosophical question according to Camus. Camus' answer to the question of suicide is no. Suicide is never the answer nor the explanation to all the absurdities in life. It is not worth it. It is up to us to live with passion, freedom, and revolt. So in our lives, we are always busy. We have so much to do. Super true ito for everyone in the academe. We are always busy and we always have to be productive. But from that wide, overarching Camusian perspective, what we call our business and productivity is mostly just a matter of repetition. It is just a cycle of everything. At dahil cycle nga lang ang lahat sa buhay natin, we should defy life's absurdities and stressors by living our life freely. And please do remember that your life matters. The world is better with you in it. If you need help, ask for it. We're always willing to be your company. Here are some contact information of mental health service provider that you may reach out. That's all. Thank you so much.